Thank you. So, namaskar and good morning to everyone. It's indeed a great pleasure to welcome you all to this very special uh, address or discussion that we are going to have today. That is a look at Sanskrit literature. And we have a very special and eminently qualified uh, personality to talk to us on this subject. That is Ambassador A&D Haksar. And I think many of you know him, but there are many youngsters who are here and they'll be joining us shortly. Ambassador Haksar is a veteran diplomat uh, belonging to the Indian Foreign Service, has served as High Commissioner and Ambassador to several countries, including Kenya, Seychelles, Yugoslavia, and Portugal. And he has also been the Dean of the Foreign Service Institute. I remember probably you were probably the first Dean, sir, if I remember correctly.
That's right, yeah. That's
Yes,
right.
and so after a very distinguished diplomatic career, he has devoted his time to the translation of Sanskrit texts from Sanskrit into English. And he has been working on these quietly, and now we have a substantive and substantial corpus of work that has come from his pen in terms of the translations of some of Sanskrit literature's leading works, and not so well known as well. And I understand he has already translated 22 works from Sanskrit into English in the last 2 decades or so. That is really phenomenal. And I think apart from the fact that now these works are available to everyone to read, and they inform the current generation about the richness of the Sanskrit literature. But I think the greater significance is in terms of the service that he has done to the Sanskrit itself. Because as you know, though Sanskrit is a very rich language, the most ancient language, I mean, but today, unfortunately, it is not widely spoken. And it has been given a status of a classical languages, which means a language which you only study in specialized courses, and only specialized people or a very narrow set of people do it. But the fact is that Sanskrit was a language of the masses, and in some sense it still is a language of the masses, because all our religious people, even the most people who do not know, who are not well read, but still they would know a few shlokas of Sanskrit. They recite Sanskrit every single day. Sanskrit is used in our daily lives, except that we don't study it very nicely. And of course, it is taught in some schools, in some colleges, but I think it's not spoken widely. And it is I think India will not become great unless we discover our past glory. No, I'm not talking in terms of any, flag waving, but the fact is that the enormously rich heritage that we have, and in which Sanskrit has played a big role, and this must be made available to the masses. And I think Ambassador Haksar's works fill that gap very nicely. And more important, I think through talks like this and through discussions like this, more people would be inspired to read Sanskrit literature, his work, of course, but otherwise also they might get inspired and take through translations or reading and writing of Sanskrit, which actually we require very urgently in the country today. I think we are at the cusp of a Indian Renaissance. I mean, 75 years we have been independent and we have seen ups and downs, etc. And you can, despite the problems in the world, but I think every Indian feels in his heart that this is the time, this is India's time now. And I think some kind of a renaissance is in the air. We may not see it, but we can feel it and we should work towards it. And it is in this context, I think the works like that of Ambassador Haksar are so very important because they not only introduce us to the Sanskrit and its richness, but also to our heritage and our past achievements, and also inspire us to work for the future. So with these words, I want to welcome you, sir. Thank you for accepting our invitation to interact in this small gathering. But I'm sure people at the end of it would be enlightened by your talk and perhaps the advice that you would like to give. And I also want to welcome very senior colleagues who are sitting here, and some of them are my friends, and for a long time, of course, neighbors also, because we live in the same society. So thank you very much for gracing the occasion. And I do hope that this will not be the first and the last, but we'll have much more such discussions in the future. So we look to you, Ambassador Haksar, as a guru, as someone who can inspire the young minds, and many of them are sitting here. So thank you very much for joining us. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Arvind Gupta, for your very kind words. And I would like to start by saying that I am very glad to have this opportunity speaking on this subject at the Vivekananda Research Foundation today, a subject, a look at Sanskrit literature. I would like to start by telling you that this is a look not from any scholarly, learned viewpoint of a professional academic and research expert. I am in this area, I regard myself as an amateur. An amateur, that is someone who likes something, who loves something, who has been reading and trying to translate from Sanskrit classics in order to understand them better and to enjoy them more. And this process for me has been going on now after my retirement for the last 2 decades, the course of which I have also discovered new works about which I was not aware. Because I began this process with translating works and reading works which I had studied long, long ago as a schoolboy. And I thought that by rereading and translating them, I would revive my knowledge. But then in the course of this, I happened to discover other works, finer classics, which was a real wonderful opportunity to see, to read, to understand, and to enjoy immensely. So this is the background in which I'm sharing with you my thoughts when I look at Sanskrit literature. Now the first thing which one should remember is that Sanskrit is an ancient language. Not only ancient, but an ancient language with a continuing history right up to present times. I think that distinguishes it from many other ancient languages about which we are aware right from the time of the Egyptian pyramids. They were there, but they're not there anymore. Sanskrit literature and the Sanskrit literary conventions have continued over all these millennia right up to now. Now, in this vast field of literature, there are some dimensions, some areas which has always been well known, well studied, even though not read by many, but still people are aware that they exist. And these works, this area is religious and philosophic literature. Everyone is aware of the names, the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Purans, and of scholars and philosophers like Shankaracharya and others who have commented on these things. And this has been there all along. And it is interesting to note that when modern studies of Sanskrit began, in colonial times about 200 years ago, the first Sanskrit works to be translated into English were from this area. You will be interested to know that the very first Sanskrit text translated into English was that of the Bhagavad Gita. This was done just before the French Revolution in 1784. An East India Company official called Charles Wilkins, whom the East India Company had sent to Benares in order to study Sanskrit. So this process goes back to that time. And the first Indian to translate from Sanskrit into English, you will be interested to know, was Raja Ram Mohan Roy, a famous name in our history, who came some decades after Wilkins's Bhagavad Gita. And the first work that he translated from Sanskrit into English was the Isha Upanishad. So the tradition of translating into English from Sanskrit has been going on for a long time. In between Ram Mohan Roy and Charles Wilkins, another East India Company official translated the Shakuntala of Kalidas. And that translation made a big impact on then European literary figures. It somehow opened a window in Europe for a look at Sanskrit. But even so, in those early years, right up to the 19th century, studies and translations of Sanskrit tended to be concentrated on religious and philosophic material associated with famous names like Max Muller. We have a road named after Max Muller here in Delhi itself, and all his works are available in libraries here all over the place. During this period, gradually, interest in modern Sanskrit studies spread from religious and philosophic to more literary and other material. And I'd like to tell you that nearly 20 years ago, I prepared a text of the then best known English translations from Sanskrit literature. which was published by the Indian Council for Cultural Relations with the title A Treasury of Sanskrit Poetry. And in that collection, I chose the very best of the numerous English translations of all kinds of Sanskrit poetry, starting with the religious and the philosophic from the Vedas, right up to the later Middle Ages, post-Mughal times and so on. And I'd like to take this opportunity of mentioning that this process of translation of Sanskrit into English also received an impetus from well-known Indian sages of the time. Two of them figure in this treasury of Sanskrit poetry, which was put out. And the first there is indeed Swami Vivekananda, after whom this foundation is named. And his beautiful translation of a poem of natural beauty from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, the Upanishad of the Great Forest. It has been put there. He translated it and called it a hymn of sweetness. It's worth a look and a read even today. And then, of course, Sri Aurobindo was the other one who made many translations from Sanskrit into English, which are also available, and some of them are quoted in this book of mine. This process continued, but the spread of Sanskrit literature covering other aspects and dimensions still remained comparatively less than that of the emphasis of religious and philosophic works. This is not to underestimate or diminish the inherent value of these religious and philosophic works, but simply to mention that they are not the beginning and the end of Sanskrit literature. And there are many other areas and dimensions which deserve more note today. That is what I would like to talk about when we look at Sanskrit literature now. I thought, after some consideration, mentioning to you three dimensions of this literature which are comparatively less known today. The first dimension I'd like to mention to you is what is called the literary form of epigrammatic verse. It is a single verse, a single stanza, 2 lines, in which an entire thought or emotion has been packed up and done so beautifully. For a variety of reasons, this kind of writing has been there in Sanskrit literature right from the beginning, from the Vedic times onwards. The Sanskrit term for these epigrammatic verses is subhashita or sukti, both meaning well said. And you find these well said verses in religious literature, philosophic literature, and then straightforward literary works, of which there are many better known and some less known. Now, this is an area which I tended to look into at some depth. One of my translations is of a text called, a 1,000-year-old text called the Amaru Shatakam. These are single verse stanzas on love, eroticism. Another work which has single verse stanzas on politics and policy, completely different area, Chanakya Niti. And the third work, which is also very well known to this day, is the Bhartrihari 300 verses. And he has 100 verses each on pleasure, on policy, and on peace. Niti, Shingar, and Vairagya. And this kind of writing shows that Sanskrit has always, maybe it is because of its grammar, maybe because in those days writing was the problem. It was better to compose than remember and pass on information by word of mouth. But for some reason, this kind of single verse making developed and it became an important part of our literature, which is continued to this day. Some of you may be seeing the Bhagavad Gita. Some of you may be familiar with the shlokas of the Bhagavad Gita. Look at them again, and you will find that many of those shlokas are in themselves Subhashita, Sukti. They combine in two lines an entire philosophic thought. Have a look and you'll see yourself. So this is one area that deserves more attention and notice today. There are many anthologies. In India, there was a traditional practice, again going back to centuries, of scholars creating verse anthologies of such verses. And many of these verse anthologies, some older than the others, covering a period of 1,000 years at least, are still in existence. And some of these I have seen, some of them I have translated selections and so on. But it shows that this is one aspect of Sanskrit literature which deserves greater look today, and it is an aspect which is easier to see also, and easier to understand. The other dimension which I would like to mention to you is the lesser known dimension of Sanskrit literature. This is what in modern language is called satire. In Sanskrit known as Vyangya, Hasya, Vidambana. Satire on life, satire on thought. Sometimes cynical, sometimes sarcastic, sometimes comic, but satire nevertheless. People have always associated Sanskrit with serious things, but this is another aspect which deserves notice. There's a lot of this literature. This came to my notice first from some writings found in Kashmir. You would be interested to know that there was a time when Kashmir was regarded as one of the founts of literary writing in Sanskrit, which spread from there all over this country. And the two satirical works which I came across in the course of my own work and studies were both from Kashmir. One is called Samaya Matrika, which is translated in English as the courtesan's keeper. And the author is a well-known name in Sanskrit literature. The name is Kshemendra. And Kshemendra lived about 1200 years ago. And this satire that I mentioned to you, the Samaya Matrika, is a satire describing the red life district of the then capital of Kashmir, which is located more or less same site as present Srinagar. But it was an active place and it has its own red light district, which the poet describes, as I said, with great humor, sarcasm, and wit. And the other I did was a collection of 3 satires by the same actor. And they deal with subjects which are very well known today, often talked about: corruption in government, hypocrisy in religion, and greed in business and trade. The satires describe thoughts, actions of 1,000 years ago, many of which may find an echo even to this day. But such works have existed in Sanskrit for a long time. Incidentally, this was only a part of Kshemendra's work. He was best known as a writer on poetics, on grammar, and literary arts and things like that. But anyway, this is an area which deserves notice today. And I'm glad that I was able to produce some of this work, bring it before the public. The third area which I would like to mention to you is even less known, I might say, practically unknown today. This is an aspect of Sanskrit literature which reflects a cultural confluence, a cultural intermingling, including of religions. In present day thinking, which has also developed over decades or more than decades, at least let us say of the last century, this aspect of Sanskrit literature has been almost totally forgotten. The 2 works which I have translated, the original title of one work, Sanskrit title, is Suleiman Charitra. It describes in Sanskrit stories that derives from Arabic sources, the love life of David and Bathsheba, and the story of the Arabian Nights. This work came to my notice through a friend who is a Sanskrit academic in New York, and she wrote to me and said that this work is there, it has been mentioned in some lecture given here in New York. So I looked for it and I discovered the manuscript in one of our national libraries in Tamil Nadu. I got hold of it, Suleiman Charitra, and it was published a few years ago as a Penguin classic. It had never been translated before. It is not mentioned in any history of Sanskrit literature or any published work. So I was very happy that this aspect of Sanskrit literature has also been, through this work, brought to the public. the people may know that in Sanskrit, the writer who was the court poet of the Lodi Sultans, pre-Mughal times, his name was Kalyan Malla. And he wrote on the basis of his Arabic, Middle Eastern sources which he had collected, the story of Suleiman, in English known as Solomon, and in Middle Eastern history known as a wise and great king. But most of his story of Suleiman is not about Suleiman, it is about his parents and their love life. David, also someone known very well in the Quran and in the Bible as Dawood, and Bathsheba, who is not known by these names, Bible or the Quran, but she is known by the Jewish name Bathsheba, which the Sanskrit writer translated as Saptasuta, seventh daughter. So anyway, it's an interesting text, deserving to be seen. And to my knowledge, it is the only text where stories of Arabian Nights, Layla, Alif Layla, have been the first time put forward in Sanskrit. The other text which I happened to come across while researching for this first one is a text from Kashmir. And the original title of the text is Katha Kautukam, which Penguin Classic decided to publish with the title A Tale of Wonder. Katha Kautukam is a Sanskrit text, the author of which also wrote the sequel to the Raj Tarangini history, and who describes himself as a person who is fluent in Persian. Because by then, Islamic culture had come through Iran and Persia into Kashmir, and this writer bases his own Katha Kautukam, Tale of Wonder, on a famous Farsi poem, Masnavi, called Yusuf wa Zulaikha. And the poem Masnavi is a style, Persian Farsi style of writing. This was such a famous poem that we know from later Mughal history that the Emperor Jahangir learned it as a child and used to recite it. Anyway, this is the story, love story of Yusuf and Zulaikha, told at two levels. At one level, as a human love story, man and woman. At another love story, as a parable of the soul in search of God. This is also a work which was never translated before. And there are many other Sanskrit works which reflect this kind of cultural confluence and intermingling, which deserve notice now in order to widen the conceptions of our ancient language and its literature, which exists and which deserves to be made better known. So now with these few words to give you an initial description of my look at Sanskrit literature, I'm not touching upon the great works we are all aware of, scriptures, the epics, and works of that nature. Neither am I touching upon scientific works, the mathematical works in Sanskrit which carry the system, decimal system of mathematics from India to the Arab world, and so on. but simple parts of literature, reading literature, which has been there, which exists there, and which deserves today to be a bit better known. So I stop at this point and be glad to have a discussion on them. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for those introductory remarks. And I think you have made some excellent points. The 2 points which strike me, one is that Sanskrit literature is much wider than just the philosophical or the religious texts. And there is a lot that still needs to be discovered, and you have already translated some, like the Suleiman Charitra. That brings me to the question, where do we find these manuscripts or the books which have not come to the notice of the translators? Are we doing enough to look for these manuscripts? Because they may not be in the libraries, they may be in the private collections. So how has this process of discovering the manuscripts that has gone on? And what should we do to speed it up, get more and more manuscripts? For instance, uh, in when I was visiting Ulaanbaatar a few years ago in Mongolia, and there they told me that in their national library, there are still um, thousands upon thousands of manuscripts, some of them in Pali, some in Sanskrit, which are lying there unattended to. And in fact, they had approached the government of India that you should digitize them. And I think we did undertake some project, but then it didn't continue. And then I think some American company came and they are doing it. I do not know what is the latest. I have discussed this with the Mongolian ambassador here on a couple of occasions. But the fact remains that there is a vast treasure of literature, probably in Sanskrit, a lot of it, which is still lying unexplored. And we don't even know where all this is. So that is my second question as to how do we give a fillip to this whole work of locating manuscripts, digitizing them, categorizing them, and then encouraging people to do translations, etc. So, I mean, this is a question I have just posed, and maybe in the meanwhile, others could also come up. So the floor is now open for questions, comments, discussion.
Well, let me give
The
you a
way,
brief answer to the very important question which you have raised.
yeah,
This kind of investigation and exploration needs to be done in a systematic way. It has to be done through an institution. The Vivekananda Foundation would perhaps provide a step into this kind of investigation. But there are also other institutions where this could be done if they are interested. We have many collections of Sanskrit manuscripts lying in different places in India. They are existing, they are mentioned in the reference material and so on, but people do not know about them. They are sitting there. This is how I found the Suleiman Charitra. I learned about it from a lady in New York. I made inquiries here. I was guided to the this library in Chennai, and then they very kindly produced the thing for me, and I was able to get a printed copy. So it existed, except that no one knew that it was there. So that happened, you might say, almost accidentally, but you need to have an institutional backup to do it in a more systematic way.
Is any comment or question? Ajit?
Yeah.
Please,
Can you hear me, Mr. Haksar?
Yes,
I can
please.
hear you very clearly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I wanted to ask you, when you said, talked of Suleiman Charitra, and you said it had Arabic influence, and you translated it. In fact, I've seen that book also. I just was interested to know, are there any other areas from the world which might have affected, our Sanskrit works or our Sanskrit literature? Uh, Are you aware of any, countries from the East or any other areas from the world?
Well, I can tell you this. I have come across little bits and pieces of information in the course of my own work.
Yeah, yeah.
At one stage, it was suggested to me by friends, and I thought that I should translate something from Buddhist literature.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Now, we all know ancient Buddhist literature is in Pali.
Mm-hmm.
It is very well known. It is also very well known
Yeah.
how the transformation in Buddhism from Hinayana, Mahayana, and Pali and Sanskrit and all these things happened. These are parts of historical information. But I was saying to myself that I would like to translate some Buddhist literature as old as possible from Sanskrit, first of all.
Mm-hmm.
And so I made investigation. I discovered a work. I was helped in my investigations by two libraries which I consult for my work and who are always very helpful. They have learned people there. One is the library of the India International Center, and the other is the library of the Sahitya Academy. And I was interested to discover that there is one text existing called the Jatak Mala.
Yeah, of course.
The Jatak Mala is a text originally written in Sanskrit. The author's name is known, Aryavara. And the important thing about Jataka Mala is it is firstly a collection of Jataka stories about Buddha's life or previous lives. The other important thing is that this is a work. It is not a translation from the Buddhist Jatakas. It is something that he made himself. And the Jataka Mala includes Jataka tales which are not to be found in Buddhist literature.
Mm.
And they are there.
Yeah.
You will find that, for example, in one of the Jatakas, one previous incarnation of Buddha
Mm. That
is
was
described as that of a king of the gods. Indra is not named, but king of the gods. So you see, you have things like this. So anyway, I got hold of this Jatakamala text. I got hold of this text through my friends at the India International Center, and I translated it, and it is there. It's moving around in the market and so on.
okay.
So this is one example that I can give you. And then there is, you might say, a collection of material which is available in libraries in Tibet. The Jatak Mala, I am told, had migrated from India. The text had been found in Lhasa and then brought back, and then, now it's being translated into English and so on. But Tibet and Dalai Lama now has a big foundation and so on. That is an important area for search for materials. it deserves some people to go and investigate it. And another area which deserves investigation, which I think not been done before, but can still be done, is the Middle East. Because there's historical evidence of Sanskrit texts being taken by scholars from here to what was then Iran and what was then Baghdad. And I have found in some of my own researches that I did that there are Persian versions in Farsi versions of Sanskrit tales which have been discovered now in modern Spain. Because as you might remember, at one time in history, Spain was under Islamic influence also. So these works are in existence, and they are available to this day. And this work that I'm talking about is a Farsi version of the Chanakya Niti. And when I was translating the Chanakya Niti and doing research for it, that is where I learnt about it. In my introduction to Chanakya Niti, I've given a quotation from this English version of this Persian translation published in Spain. So you have this kind of mingling also, but it deserves investigation. Then another area where there are Sanskrit texts which are available, which need investigation, is in Southeast Asia. In the libraries of Indonesia, in the libraries of Thailand, and libraries of Vietnam and places like that. These are areas still, I don't know whether anyone is doing any work there or not, but individuals have, and in the course of my reading here and there, I discover that these people have made indications of the fact that such works are available in those areas. So it's a question of someone making an effort to get to these things with the energy and the resources to do that. So this is what I can say about this. These are nearby areas, an area which I think the easiest for us to investigate, the most convenient and closest, is the court library. I don't know whether it's still called the court library or not, but in Nepal. Some of our texts which have been printed and which are circulating in India have their origins in the court library of Nepal, where they were discovered. So you see, you have this kind of thing. And then, as you said, it has spread further north into Mongolia and so on. About that, I can't tell you very much because I haven't a clue.
Thank you very much. Whether
I had a question.
yes, Janasani.
Thank you so much, sir. It was wonderful to hear you about this fantastic language. My problem is that here is a majestic language. Here is a language which is got amazing literature, and it is possible to make it a linked language which doesn't, give rise to any controversies in whichever part of India it is learned or spoken. Unfortunately, I think we have made it a sacred language and we have made it a classical language. The best way of ruining a language, burying it, is to make it a classic language. which means you put so much of mystery to it that it requires scholars to demystify it. It takes an effort to read it. That is what has unfortunately happened. And that's what we Indians have done to this magnificent language, which is known as throughout the world, as the most scientific language. I have a nodding acquaintance with this language because I studied it in the high school and never pursued it further. And today also, once again, you find the students laboring on it and they leave it ultimately. I think what should be done to make it a living language again? What should be done to tell the people in this country that just by worshipping those fantastic philosophical grunts and just putting them in a place along with our idols, that's not the service to this language at all. So you see, instead of searching this language and the books, etc., outside India, I think first there is a requirement to revive this language. And by reviving, I mean really make it a bit of a living language. And this is what I want to just, I just want to again ask you. I mean, when I look at it, how was it that Shankaracharya, who belonged to Kerala, could communicate with the Kashmiri Brahmins or with some people in the East? The only language, common language they had, that was Sanskrit. And probably there were no accents also, because in Sanskrit it's very difficult to have a Madrasi accent or a Punjabi accent. I am a Punjabi, I can ruin any language I sort of pronounce. But this language debars you from doing that. So how can we revive this language, sir? That's what I want to ask you. You are an eminent ambassador and you have done so much of work on it. What can you do to induce each one of us to stop worshipping this language, to learn this language? Thank you.
Well, that is a very pertinent and nice question, Mr. Ravi. What I'd like to tell you is, from the little bit that I have seen of Sanskrit literature so far in the course of my own work, classical literature tends to fall. I'm not talking of the dharma or darshan. I'm not talking about the Shruti and the Smriti, the sacred scriptures. I'm talking about common literature. Tends to get divided into kavya and katha. Literature which is poetic and literature which is expressed prose writings. Now, for a variety of historical reasons, concentration of study, translation, and knowledge has focused on the Kavya literature, and it has not focused on the Katha literature. And there's a lot of Katha literature which is around, which deserves to be brought into public knowledge through the process of translation. I can tell you a little bit about this because in the course of my own work, I have translated also 2 works of Katha literature. One is the well-known Shuka Saptati, 70 Tales of the Parrot. It has been around for a long time, it has traveled abroad. Its tales are known in Arabic, in Persian, all kinds of languages, they've been everywhere. But the Shuka Saptati, the Sanskrit text, which I happen to get hold of and translate into English, is, if I may put it this way, it is not classic language, it is written in colloquial language. There is a colloquial Sanskrit also, the language which people spoke in towns and small villages, etc. It contains words which today classicists would consider obscene, but they are there. And when they spoke about it, that is how they spoke. And the stories of the Shuka Saptati are not stories about princes, sages, big shots. They are about farmers, blacksmiths, shoemakers, people like that. So you have this kind of work also. The other one which I came across and I translated, origins of Shuka Saptati, people are not very clear, but it is people dated to say about the 11th or 12th century. And maybe as it progressed, number of stories in it increased, grew. But I've not gone into these things from the historical point of view. I can just tell you as someone who translated. The other one which I've done, it was published with the title Tale of Love. It is a story, love story. I'm now forgetting the original Sanskrit text name. A love story of a small town man who fell in love with a courtesan,
Madhav and Kama.
Madhav and Kama. Madhav, it is the original name of the text is Madhava Nala Katha. And how Madhav and Kama, Madhav was a small town man, Kama Kandala, she was a courtesan, and how they fell in love, and how they were brought together by the fabulous king Vikramaditya, because they both appealed to him. And he said, yes, I will help you come together. So you have these works also. Now they are written in Sanskrit, but they are written in what you might say comparatively simple Sanskrit. You might say almost colloquial Sanskrit. Such works exist, and there are many others also which exist. So as you've said, these works need to be investigated and so on. Who is going to do it in a big way? I can only give you some examples of what I've done in my own small little way, but you need to have an institutional effort. I think what is needed now is an institutional effort to bring more Katha literature in Sanskrit out of the libraries and out of the scholarly places where it's kept, through translation into the public life. And you will find that this is a new another face of Sanskrit, which is worth having a look at. But Mr. Swami, I think you raised a very important point, and I'm very glad that you mentioned it.
Thank you. There is this question in the chat box from Sukant Saran. Languages usually evolve over centuries. Can you elaborate on the changes in Sanskrit language that have taken place over thousands of years?
That is a question I should tell you straight away. I am not qualified and educated enough to answer. I can tell you just generally that there is a clear distinction between Vedic Sanskrit and post-Vedic Sanskrit. That anyone who looks at those texts can see. You can see the changes which have taken, how the language is evolved. I can't tell you more about it because I have not investigated and studied this. But what I have noticed is that in texts, many texts which I have translated have no fixed, determined date. But some texts do have a clear idea of where they are coming from, which century and so on. And I have found that there are some texts which use, in Sanskrit, some texts use words which are of a later source, not original Sanskrit source, but of later source. There are words You might say a word like Yavan. Yavan is an older word. At one stage, it referred to all people coming from outside. So there were Yavan people, Yavan Bhasha, etc., etc. Another word which appeared a little later was Malech. Both are Sanskrit words, but in earlier texts you don't find the word Malech, and in later texts you find both the word Yavan and Malech. So you see, you have this kind of change, and then there are several other words where you have this. But I can't give you an answer to these questions. You need someone who is qualified to talk about it. But I'm very pleased to have your questions, both of you.
Ambassador Devare wants to make a comment.
Thank you, sir. It was a very illuminating talk. We really benefited a great deal. I have a couple of comments regarding the unattended manuscripts which you find all over the world, and not much effort is currently perhaps going on. I don't know. It is actually many institutions are working, but I feel that the newly revived Nalanda University perhaps could take up this project, and they can be supported by. There are even now there are very eminent institutions like the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute in Pune, or the Banaras Hindu University, or Rajasthan University. All of them can work together, and Vivekananda Foundation can also, I think, join hand. Concept note will have to be made. ICCR will have to support it. Government of India will have to support it. But this is a project which needs to be taken up. Secondly, Sanskrit may not be spoken today widely in the country, though I am aware of one village in Karnataka where people continue to speak and transact entire business in Sanskrit even today. So how they do it, how this evolved in that place in a village, I think it could be an interesting study. But besides that, most of the Indian languages are derived from Sanskrit. And, I think all of us are aware of nearly 30, 40, 50% of the words in our languages which come from Sanskrit. So study of Sanskrit in schools, even though it is not made compulsory because it doesn't work out easily, if that is encouraged, then I think apart from the knowledge of Sanskrit that will get widened, it will also help learning and understanding of our own regional languages, which is also important. The organic connection between Sanskrit and the Indian languages must be encouraged and really promoted. And there, I think Sanskrit plays, in my view, a very important role. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I think that is again a very important point that you have made, Sudhir. As you were making that point, it occurred to me that the impression that Sanskrit is all classical language, this impression is denied even in the writings of famous poets like Kalidas. My latest Kalidasa translation of the Vikram Urvashi has one whole act to the play, which consists of singing and dancing dialogues, not in classical Sanskrit, but in what is known as Prakrit and Apabhramsh, because they are being talked about by people from villages and places like that. So it shows that Sanskrit has many other dimensions which are tending to be forgotten because there has been such an emphasis on the classics. And as you have said, a lot of Indian languages now prevalent are really have sources which have developed from Sanskrit itself. So you can find the common words of this stretching all across this country. If you need, someone could make a small dictionary of words, Sanskrit origin words, which are common in most Indian languages, stretching from Assamese on one side to Gujarati at the other side, Maharashtrian. And from Kashmir, this day Kashmir, right down to present day Tamil Nadu. So you have this kind of thing which is there, but it needs to be brought together so that people have an overall understanding of these things. Who is going to do this? As you mentioned, you've been very good enough to suggest that many institutions can join into this, but someone has to initiate this kind of action.
Thank you.
Maybe the Vivekananda Foundation, which has sponsored this program today, maybe they can play a role in this.
While talking to a few people, I discovered that there's also this problem of dictionaries. The oldest and most widely used dictionary, I'm told, you know better, is this Monier-Williams dictionary, which I think was written in 19th century. And now there has been this demand that with so much progress in technology and in so many other fields, so many new words have come in. So we need an updated dictionary, which is written by the Indians themselves. So we took up this proposal with many people, but somehow we were not able to make much progress. Though I understand that Bharati Vidya Bhavan has now started a project of writing an 8-volume dictionary from Sanskrit into English. So what is your take on the available tools, both dictionaries and maybe some digital tools also, to help the translations? That is my first question. And the second question is, in your surveys of literature, ancient literature or medieval literature, did you come across any manuscripts which talked about the other countries and other cultures? Of course, you mentioned about Suleiman Charith, but there was a very close connection between India and Greeks, and during the Mauryan Empire, and later on the Indo-Greek Empire that was set up. So while we see a lot of mention of India in Greek writings, do you find any mention of Greece in Indian writings, Sanskrit writings, or for that matter, because Indians were traveling all the time? So did they translate what they saw when they stepped out of India?
Well, the last point you raised, the answer is very simple. The word Yavan, which is an ancient Sanskrit word, is regarded as derived from the Greek area of Ionia. Yavan is Ionian.
Okay.
The Greeks who first came to India in the time of the Mauryas or before that were known as Ionians, and this is how the word Yavan came into existence. So you have that. Now, Sanskrit literature, its availability in these areas, I cannot tell you very much about. I have not investigated it. I discovered during my own time when I was a master in Portugal many, many years ago that in Portugal I have a library, not very big, but very old, library of Sanskrit texts, which the Portuguese had brought out of Goa in the several centuries that they ruled the area. And these texts were sitting in Lisbon, and I was told by people there that there were very few people takers to look at them because interest in this area had meanwhile tended to disappear. So I brought it to the notice of the ministry and so on, but there's a you might say there's a collection which is sitting there also, and I'm sure that there are collections of texts sitting in various places, in different places. I have for myself, with my own eyes, seen a collection in a university library in Toronto, Canada. And that is a collection based upon material collected by a single scholar whom Dr. Anthony Warder, whom I got to know in his last years, who presented it to the library. And he spent the whole life of it, 3 or 4 decades, of collecting Sanskrit manuscripts from all over the place and put them. So you have these kind of text collections in different parts of the world, except that they need to be investigated and listed so that people are aware that these things exist.
Like in our recent discussions on Tibet, someone told us that Dalai Lama's office and they have been now collecting some very seminal manuscripts which are available, and I think they may be in various languages. But they want, if some people want to translate it, etc., these are probably available. So I think, and similarly, if you go to Sikkim and you see in their library or Rumtek monastery, etc., you still find, huge number of manuscripts practically untouched and waiting to be read and translated and so on. And similarly in many other places, monasteries, etc. So I think the government, and this cannot be done at an individual level. Individually, okay, you will go see one text, two texts, you might, but a systematic effort, as you said, is required, and a mission. You really require a mission-oriented approach. Collect millions of these things which are scattered all over, and make sure that these are come into the reckoning and then translated, etc. So, is there any other question? Any comment?
You mentioned when Mr. Gupta, you spoke of outside influences on Sanskrit. When refers to the fragment coming from Java.
Sorry, your voice is breaking. We can't really understand what you're saying.
This I
think the connection is bad. We haven't been able to understand what you said. Yeah, now it's a little better. Maybe you'll try again. No.
Okay. Can you now?
I'm sorry, it is breaking.
Okay.
So
That's
you can
okay.
take it offline with the Ambassador Haksar. Yeah, okay. Any other question or comment?
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry about that. I think we can't really understand,
Yeah.
comprehend what you're saying. Okay, if there is no further question, hello, yes, anybody? Well, I think
just to supplement what you earlier said, I just wanted to know from Mr. Haksar, since you are aware of the field so well, what kind of surveys, a survey of literature is being prepared on Sanskrit literature in different fields? Are there good authoritative works that are going on in our universities, particularly that you're aware of? So that these various schools that you mentioned, or various areas that are not touched so well, are covered in these surveys, and also mention what kind of literature is available in these fields. So I just wanted to know whether you are aware of that kind of work.
Well, again, my knowledge of these things is a little limited, but I can tell you there are two works which I did for the ICCR, the Indian Council for Cultural Relations, many years ago when I was still, active enough to do such work. One I have mentioned already. It was the Treasury of Sanskrit Poetry, which is, in my opinion, the collection of the best English translations of the best Sanskrit literature so far found anywhere. The other one I did for them is called Glimpses of Sanskrit Literature, which includes short essays on different aspects of Sanskrit literature written by distinguished scholars both from India and abroad on different aspects. It took us time to choose the subjects and choose the authors, but then they all came together and we have a book, this Glimpses of Sanskrit Literature, which has short essays which cover the entire gamut of Sanskrit literature. So both these books are there, they are available, and maybe they deserve now to be, they're both, I should say, about 10 or 15 years old, and they deserve now to be updated and made bigger by someone, by those institutions or by some other institution, or some totally new book made. These are ideas which are there and they can be put into action by those who are interested. My own work now is just limited to translating areas of Sanskrit which I feel need to be brought into public knowledge because they are not well known. I'm now trying to make a translation of an anthology of Sanskrit humor, Hasya Rasa. People are not aware that a sacred language has a Hasya Rasa also. So that's what I'm doing now.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, is anybody would like to ask any other question or any comment? Okay, so Shriradha, would you like to express a vote of thanks?
Also unstable nets. I'm keeping the video off, but would take this opportunity to, on behalf of VIF, to thank Mr. Haskar for this work that he's produced. It's not very, I mean, while at VIF, we of course constantly are trying to look at the Indic civilization and how the impact it has, and also looking at how contemporary political conditions have isolated these work, or also perhaps influenced in a larger way. But more and more discussion of this kind of work, and of course the point that Dr. Gupta made about how many of them, I've been to the Rumtek monastery and seen the kind of work which remains unused and collected there. They possibly, I think, I'm hoping that after your talk today, the younger generation will be inspired to take up this kind of work. It's a very difficult task. We all know it's kind of takes years to kind of study with any even semblance of understanding of this subject. But there's a wealth of knowledge in our many of our monasteries and libraries which remain unexplored. And we are very grateful that you've kind of opened your eyes to that. And I think it's inspiring. And I'm really hoping that we can take this beyond this particular ambit of VIF today, but ensure that how our younger generation can understand what remains behind many of these unexplored doors. And thank you again for this sharing of your knowledge with us. And I do hope that the days to come, we will take this to a larger and a greater audience, where I think many of the younger generation would need to know. I mean, I think it's a hugely learning opportunity for all of us. Thank you once again for everybody's participation here.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for being with us. A very stimulating discussion. So I only want to say that I think translation should be one of the greatest missions of any country, particularly in a multicultural, religious society like ours. And I think we must learn something from the Chinese. They translate a huge amount. I think all developed countries, they pay a lot of attention to translation. You talk about translations